Good afternoon and welcome back to Draven's Den. If this is your first time listening, this is the show where we slow history down, stretch it out, and remind ourselves that the past wasn't lived in neat chapters. Just like life, it was lived in half-finished plans, bad timing, and people doing their best without knowing how the story would turn out. Today's episode is the Weekend Roundup, covering January 17th through January 19th. The stretch of the month where January stops pretending it's helpful and starts acting like it's in charge. This is the point where the calendar insists you're settled in, while your brain is still negotiating basic cooperation. History has been here before, repeatedly, and not once did it handle it gracefully. Let's get into it. History usually introduces people by their titles: general, governor, founding father. But most of the people who carried the American Revolution forward never got a statue. They didn't give speeches. They didn't get paintings made of them. Most of them were just people who reached a moment where staying quiet was no longer an option. This is where I want to start something new on the show. Not a history lesson, not a genealogy podcast, just a thread, a family thread. Because history doesn't disappear when the textbooks stop. It keeps moving through families, whether we name it or not. One of those threads in my family leads back to a man named William Nuckolls. In family records, he's remembered as William the Patriot Nuckolls. Not because he held rank, not because he signed anything famous, but because when the choice came, he picked a side, and he stuck with it. While William did not fight in the Revolutionary War, he furnished beef and other supplies for the Continental Army, and he even sold the army a gun. For this, he was given the title of Patriot. These actions also prevented harassment by the local Committee of Safety, who looked unkindly on those who supported the king's cause. William lived in colonial Virginia, in a time when declaring yourself a patriot wasn't a slogan. It was a risk. Communities were small. Everyone knew everyone, and loyalty wasn't theoretical. It was watched, whispered about, and remembered. Supporting the patriot cause meant you were willing to be seen as a traitor to the crown. It meant potential loss of land, safety, reputation, and sometimes family relationships. Neutrality might sound safe to us now, but back then, neutrality often meant suspicion from both sides. William didn't stay neutral. He aligned himself with the revolutionary cause, backing independence at a time when Britain was still the most powerful empire on the planet. There was no guarantee this experiment would work. No promise the colonies wouldn't be crushed and remembered only as a failed rebellion. And here's the part that matters most to me. He didn't know how it would end. We talk about American Revolution like the outcome was inevitable. It wasn't. People like William were betting their future on an idea that hadn't proven itself yet. That's what made him a patriot. Not victory, but conviction. William the Patriot Nuckolls didn't live long enough to see the United States become what it would eventually be. But his decision echoed forward anyway. Through his family, through generations, through time. He's my fifth great-granduncle, which means I wouldn't know his name at all if someone hadn't decided that what he did mattered enough to remember. And I think that's the quiet truth about history. Most of it survives not because it was famous, but because someone cared enough to pass it on. This show exists because I believe the past isn't something we visit, it's something we're already standing in. William didn't know he was making history. He was just making a decision. And most of the people whose stories we never hear, they were doing the exact same thing. This is the first part of what I'm calling the family thread. Over the next couple of episodes, I'll talk about what that decision cost, what it changed, and how it still echoes forward. And eventually, I want to open this thread up. Because my family isn't the point. The pattern is. History doesn't live in museums alone. It lives in last names, in handed down stories, in the choices that ripple forward long after the moment has passed. All right, let's step back into the wider world for a minute, because while William was making his stand, history everywhere else was doing what it always does, being loud, strange, and deeply human. January 17th has a long history of drawing lines, some necessary, some deeply flawed. On January 17, 1929, Al Capone was convicted of contempt of court for carrying a concealed weapon in Philadelphia. Not murder, not racketeering, not bootlegging, a gun charge. History loves irony, and this is one of its favorites. One of the most notorious criminals in American history didn't stumble on some grand moral reckoning. He tripped over paperwork and jurisdiction. It's a reminder that systems don't always fail loudly. Sometimes they succeed quietly, sideways, and just enough to matter. January 17th is also the day in 1773 that Captain James Cook became the first person to cross the Antarctic Circle. He didn't discover Antarctica. He didn't conquer it. He mostly logged frustration, ice, and the strong opinion that nothing useful lived there. History didn't reward him with land. It rewarded him with knowledge and frostbite. Not every milestone comes with a parade. Some come with better maps and fewer illustrations. On a lighter note, January 17th is also the birthday of Michelle Obama, a reminder that discipline, humor, and patience can coexist, even under relentless scrutiny. January 18th carries the kind of history that whispers instead of shouts. On January 18, 1911, Eugene Ely landed in an airplane on the deck of a ship for the first time. It lasted seconds. The plane barely stopped. And no one was sure it was a good idea. Now it's how modern navies function. History doesn't always recognize innovation when it happens. Sometimes it just stares at it and asks, should we be worried? January 18th also marks the death of Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling. You guys know me in names. In 1936, a writer whose words shaped empire-era thinking, often uncomfortably so. His work reminds us that influence doesn't equal correctness, and legacy doesn't come with editorial notes. History preserves everything. Interpretation is our job. And because January enjoys contrast, this date also marks the first transmission of a radio signal from a ship in distress that actually worked as intended. Prior attempts had failed, been ignored, or misunderstood. The lesson wasn't technological, it was human. Being able to speak doesn't guarantee being heard. January 19th is a hinge point kind of day. In 1809, Edgar Allan Poe was born. A man whose work captured anxiety, obsession, and internal collapse with comfortable precision. He didn't invent darkness in literature. He just stopped pretending it wasn't there. History often celebrates optimism. Poe documented what happens when optimism runs out. January 19th is also notable for being the final day of many U.S. presidencies. It's the moment when power pauses. Boxes are packed and reality sets in. History doesn't end administrations with speeches. It ends them with moving trucks. The handoff is rarely clean. It's human, and sometimes it's the most honest moment of the job. Before we wrap up the weekend, we need to address something January keeps implying. January is lying to you. It tells you this is the month where strength means pushing harder, where discipline looks like intensity, where rest is weakness. Historically, that's backwards. January has always been the month where survival depended on restraint, where people rationed energy, not burned it, where patience mattered more than ambition, where historical failures tied to January didn't come from doing too little. They came from doing too much, too fast, with too little daylight. If you're pacing yourself right now, that's not quitting. That's wisdom with a calendar. January doesn't reward force. It rewards longevity. And some strange January history. In January 1700, Sweden adopted a calendar system that accidentally skipped leap years incorrectly, causing the country to exist on a date no one else recognized for decades. Sweden was technically living in a time zone of its own making. In January 1934, a man attempted to sue the Weather Bureau after planning an outdoor wedding during a forecasted mild winter. The case was dismissed, but the judge reportedly said, January owes no one anything. In mid-January 1992, McMurdo Station in Antarctica ran out of fresh vegetables, leading scientists to hold a ceremonial salad funeral. This was considered morale boosting. In January 1816, newspapers reported a man surviving a fall into a frozen river by remaining calm and insulting the cold until it gave up. This method is not medically recommended, but emotionally effective. January has never been about dignity. It's about persistence with a sense of humor. Now, before we close, a quick personal note. Laura Trail didn't reach its Kickstarter goal. That chapter ended without fireworks or headlines. Just a quiet stop and a moment to reassess. That doesn't erase the idea. It sharpens it. Projects like Laura Trail aren't built in straight lines. They zig, they pause. They learn what not to do. And then they keep going differently. The story isn't finished. It's just being rewritten with better margins. If you were part of that first attempt in any way, thank you. That mattered more than numbers. January doesn't care how productive you feel. It cares whether you last long enough to see February. If this weekend finds you tired, reflective, or pacing yourself instead of sprinting, you're not behind. You're historically consistent. Thank you for spending the last part of your weekend here with The Den. I'm Stan, and that's a wrap.